The castle was basically built between about 1085 and 1087 by a Bernard de Croft. It was originally would have been a wooden structure, then became a very standard square-shaped stone castle. And then in the 14th century, around about 1398-99, when Owen Glendower was about, there was a John de Croft, and he actually married one of Owen Glendower's daughters. He had 3 daughters, one of whom was called Janet. John de Croft married Janet, which we think might be the first reference to Janet and John. So, some of you who may have been to Croft might recognise the gentleman there, or the grave at least, who was born around about then. Again, records are never that precise for that period. Fought for Edward Earl of March, who later became Edward IV, and he was a Yorkist. Fought all those various battles. Mortimer's Cross was actually fought on, we believe, Croft land, so he didn't really have much of an excuse not to turn up. Towton was later on that year, and was amazing victory for the Yorkists. The Yorkists comprehensively won. And then at Tewkesbury, Yorkists won again. Sir Richard Croft actually took the surrender of Henry VI's son, Edward, the then Prince of Wales. It is said that Edward surrendered his sword to him in an apple orchard. By the normal rules, he should have been taken prisoner and ransomed. But by then, the Wars of the Roses, which it was, or the Cousins' War as they often call it, had descended into a very simple process. We've captured him, we take his head off, he doesn't turn up again. And they actually broke sanctuary, because a lot of these people, including young Edward, took refuge in the abbey there. And the Yorkists said, no, we're not having that, and broke the rules, burst in, dragged them out, and executed most of them on the steps, which was rather unpleasant. Then we had the Battle of Bosworth, which we're not quite sure why, but Sir Richard Croft didn't turn up, as did a lot of others also not turn up. Richard III didn't have the strongest grip. And after that, surprisingly, Sir Richard Croft ended up as controller of Henry VII's household, and actually fought, or certainly turned up, sent people along to the Battle of Stoke Heath, which was one of the rebellions against Henry VII, and was awarded a Knight Banneret. And that was basically for either turning up yourself and helping, or sending enough lads to make a difference. And as you can see, he died in 1509, the same year as Henry VII. His own wife, and he was knocking on 80 by then, his wife outlived him by 10 years. She was 90. So quite good stuff. Then moving on to the next century, we have this rather glum-looking gentleman. He was Sir James Croft, and he was born then. And he was, from what I've read, quite a sort of self-serving person, made sure he did all right. This is something he got slightly wrong, because those of you probably know, William Wyatt and about 4 others, including him, decided that having Mary on the throne was a really bad idea, but unfortunately they weren't very good at it and got caught. And what they actually wanted to do at the same time was discredit Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth. They didn't dare actually execute her themselves. They didn't have sufficient grounds. So they thought, I know, we'll get James Croft to implicate her in the whole thing and tell us that it was her idea. And the expression is that he was, shall we say, marvellously tossed and examined. We'll leave you to imagine what they did. It usually involved the rack. Surprisingly, he refused. And as we know, history moved on, and Elizabeth came to the throne, and he basically was brought to her attention by Robert Dudley, and he gained that position and did very well for himself. So, moving on again, this gentleman was Sir William Croft. We now moved into the 17th century, and he was born then and was, at the time of the Civil War, the top royalist in Herefordshire. He was actually a gentleman of the bedchamber or the privy chamber, which was a very, very top aide and courtier to the king himself. And in fact, slightly unpleasantly, the system was that the king didn't actually get a lot of time to himself, not even at night, because gentlemen of the bedchamber would sleep in there with him, or certainly take him in there, and then make sure he came out in the morning. And there were others who formed rather more personal things of actually escorting him to the toilet, but we won't go into that. And he fought at Edge Hill in 1642, and cleverly got captured and was kept in Bristol for a year before being released. And then in 1645, in about June, the Royalists really weren't doing very well by this point, and there was a gentleman called Sir Michael Woodhouse, who was governor of Ludlow at the time, and he decided to scrape together a force of soldiers, got about, 2,000 odd, hastily got together. And I don't know if any of you know Marriott Edgar, any of his monologues, but there was a wonderful phrase he used, let's go and put the wind up Saxons. So Michael Woodhouse decided, let's go and put the wind up Parliament, and we'll go and have a go at Stokesay Castle. And 600 parliamentarians were hanging around the place, and they got as far as Wistonstow, the Royalists, and then came across these parliamentarians, only about 600 of them, and said, oh, right, what are we going to do now? And then a furious row broke out about who was actually in charge. So they dithered about, and eventually the parliamentarians thought, well, we're not going to hang about here all day, and they attacked. And Sir William Croft led a bunch of men from Luston, which is between Ludlow and Leominster. They bravely remembered appointments elsewhere and legged it, along with most of the rest of the soldiers, because they really didn't want to be there. And it is said that Sir William was actually chased from the battlefield, pursued all the way back to Croft. Probably not. It was a good 10, 11 miles. They weren't going to do that. But the legend is he got as far as Croft Castle, was about to go into the castle, and was shot down off his horse. And we had what was then the William Oak, which is the spot where he apparently fell. The tree has actually done the same now. It's actually fallen, sadly. It is more likely that he actually died on the battlefield, I'm afraid, so sorry about that. But he had a brother who was, as I say, he was killed then. This gentleman, he's Herbert Croft, and he was Bishop of Hereford. In 1644 was appointed chaplain to Charles I and a dean of Hereford diocese. And if you go to Hereford Cathedral and look at the west door at the end by the sort of Broad Street side of it, and you look to the left of that door up in the top, and there's actually a stone tablet that shows someone in a pulpit waving his arms and some soldiers. And basically what happened was some parliamentarian soldiers came in and started to heckle. And it got quite unpleasant. They were literally pointing muskets at him. And he gave them a serious telling off. And I don't know what he said, but they got very embarrassed and left. So they've commemorated that on the side of the cathedral. There he is with all of that, and Dean of Hereford, and eventually became Bishop of Hereford as a reward for being loyal to the king. Because obviously during the Commonwealth, he had to keep a very low profile because the religion was a little different then. He also had to rebuild Croft Castle, because in the year previously, Sir Michael Woodhouse, having made a complete mess of the Battle of Wistonstow, decided, well, we're not going to have Croft Castle used by Parliament, so they did a thing called slighting. And what that was, basically, was something developed by Cromwell in particular, was basically wreck it. So it's no use to anybody, which also means you don't have to leave a garrison for it to be captured by the next lot. So the Bishop of Hereford restored or rebuilt Croft Castle. There was a lot of doubt as to where it was actually originally, but we think that what you see now is on the old foundations, because there are bits of it where the foundations and the walls are really, really thick. So it's the best. Again, one of the problems at Croft is a lot of the paperwork disappeared. We think it was either tidied up and burnt, but we're not sure. So we haven't got a lot of those historical ledgers that you see in other places like Chatsworth, that they can say, you know, Robert Jones was the butler in 1848 and this was his shopping list. We haven't got any of that, I'm afraid. Don't have kitchens either. So the Bishop of Hereford was awarded that and died in 1691. So, moving on again, his son, and being very imaginative, he was called Herbert as well. He basically was created baronet in 1671 by Charles II as a sort of nod for services rendered by the family. It's not that special. Baronet is actually the lowest form of title you can give anybody. But it was nice. And the title still carries on, but not in this country. But I'll tell you why later. So, he was quite important in his own right, and then died at that time. So, going into the next century, this gentleman was another Croft, and he was William Croft, who basically you may or may not know what those are. They are actually a series of musical songs or phrases, and he wrote them because he was actually appointed organist at Westminster Abbey in about 1708. And his gravestone, and there's a wall-mounted memorial to him. And he created these funeral sentences for the funeral of Queen Anne. He also did the music for the coronation of George I. But the thing about the funeral sentences is they have been used for every single state funeral or occasion like that since then, right up to the Queen Elizabeth II's funeral a couple of years ago. Very important man that nobody's ever heard of. So, and he died then. So, moving on again, this rather sort of plain-looking gentleman was yet another Herbert. I'm sorry about that. He was the third baronet, and he was Sir Archer Croft. I apologise, he wasn't a Herbert at all. I've jumped a bit. As you can tell, I'm good at this. Born then, and he had to sell Croft Castle because it is said that he fell foul, as many other people did, to the South Sea bubble, a bit like the dot-com bubble. So he sold it to a chap called Richard Knight, who was a very powerful ironmaster, came from Downton. And his daughter Elizabeth married a man called Thomas Johns. And being a nice man, Richard Knight bought Croft Castle as a wedding present, as you do. And he died then, was Sir Archer Croft. The daughter, Elizabeth, her son actually went off to create a place called Havod near Devil's Bridge in Wales, which is quite held up as, at the time, as an example of the picturesque movement, which, if you know about landscapes, it's the absolute opposite of Capability Brown, who everything was neat and tidy. The picturesque movement was to take advantage of the land that was already there. And so in about 1798, Elizabeth decided she was fed up with living in the country. She really was a city girl. So she sold it and disappeared off to London. But she sold Croft to a man called Somerset Davies, who was the Ludlow MP at the time. And he and his family stayed there right the way through, descending through into the 20th century. But the Crofts carried on. And this gentleman was Sir Richard Croft. And he was born then. And he was physician and accoucheur to the royal family. Anyone know what an accoucheur was?
Like a male midwife.
Yes. And Francesca's trying not to die. I'm sorry about that. It's all right. It's your fault I'm here, that's why. So he was physician and accoucheur to the royal family, so male midwife effectively, because of course ladies weren't allowed. And Princess Charlotte was the daughter of George III. Sorry, the Prince Regent, I apologise. And the Prince Regent, as you know, was a bit of a man about town and a lad. But he was told he had, in the late 18th century, he married Princess Caroline of Mecklenburg, I think it was. I'm not very good at these German titles.
Brunswick.
Thank you. See? It's teamwork. And he hated her on sight. In fact, when she was introduced to him and she walked into the room, he turned to his butler and said, "Fetch me a glass of brandy," and left the room. But he was basically told by Parliament, if you don't marry her, we won't settle your debts. So he did, and got appallingly drunk at the wedding, and off they went for the nuptials. In the morning, he was found face down in the fire grate. But somewhere along the line, in the middle of all that, by some miracle, they actually conceived Princess Charlotte. And she was what, you may remember when Diana died, Tony Blair coined the phrase, the people's princess. He didn't coin it at all, she was. She was a rarity at that time of being an incredibly popular royal, because she went out and about, she talked to them, she didn't run around eating, drinking and having fun. And she married a chap called Ferdinand, who was sort of spare at the time. He was Belgian. And they got married, and in November 1817, she was ready to give birth. So along comes Richard Croft, and it started to go wrong. The labour lasted over 24 hours. He really didn't know what to do. He tried all the usual things of bleeding, which of course, as we know, was the last thing he should be doing. They did have forceps at that time, but he didn't dare use them. And ultimately, she gave birth to a stillborn baby boy, and a few hours later, she died, which was effectively a national disaster, because at that point, the royal line stopped, because none of the other brothers of the Prince Regent had really got any legitimate children. They got plenty of children, but none of them were legitimate. So government turned around and said, right, you lot, put your mistresses and everything else, stop mucking about. If you haven't got a wife, find one, get married, produce an heir now. And the winner was the Duke of Kent. He produced in 1819 a daughter who was called Victoria. So this man was directly involved in changing history and producing Victoria, who would never have been if Charlotte had given birth to a healthy child. Now, he died, as you might say, suspiciously young. It is actually said that he committed suicide because he got absolutely hammered in the press. And one of the things you did in those days in London was if you visited people and stayed overnight, there were quite often pistols in the room to avoid, because a lot of people broke into houses, they mugged people, murdered them. And he was found in the morning lying in his bed like that after they'd heard a bang in the night. Very sad. So, moving on. We're now going into the 20th century. And this gentleman, Sir Herbert Archer Croft, 10th Baronet and captain in the Herefordshire Regiment, 1st Battalion. And unusually in the First World War, the Herefordshire Regiment itself was kept at home for defence purposes. But the 1st Battalion was part of an expedition in 1915 to the Dardanelles. The rather ill-fated effort to try and break through the Bosphorus into the Black Sea and sort out the Turks. Sadly, it didn't work, as you might know from history. And one of the things they did was to attempt a sort of amphibious landing further along at a place called Suvla Bay. That didn't work very well either, because that's where he died. And as is said, he was last seen leading his men into the smoke, and it is guessed something like a sniper dealt with him. So he was left, or his widow Catherine was left with a son, James, who was now the 11th baronet. But in 1923, the Kevil Davises, as they'd become, Somerset Davies family evolved into the Kevil Davises, had finally run out of money. They tried renting Croft out, they tried mortgaging Croft until the bank pointed out you can't mortgage a mortgage. So they put it into an auction. And lot number 1 was the house and 30 acres. And it was up for £30,000. And they bought it and came back from where they'd been living near Hereford at Lugwardine House. And between the wars, they increased the holdings to about the 1,500 odd acres that we know now. And in 1937, they actually knocked down the servants' wing because they couldn't afford it. The legend was if you knock down bits of Croft, they'd get, this bad luck would get you. And James the 11th baronet, which is this lad, he was a bit of a petrolhead, a bit of a man about town, very much into his fast cars. In fact, so fast he was fined for speeding through Marlborough at 20 miles an hour. But he loved whizzing around the lanes and all of that around Croft in sports cars. Sadly, I think there was a display in the saloon at Croft which had photographs of him, and there's a picture of him in a little 2-seat sports car and pipe in front of the castle, but I think they've changed that display now, sadly. But that's him, Sir James, 11th baronet, but he became a captain in the Royal Marine Commandos very early in the war, and was part of the expeditionary force when they said, well, we've created these commandos, what are we going to do with them? So they went off and had fun in Norway, which went predictably wrong. And they went back to Scotland, and in 1941 he was found in his hotel room, and the official explanation was that he'd been cleaning his pistol when it went off. Nobody's quite sure why. Possibly he struggled with the losses they incurred during the Norway campaign. We don't know. But because of that, he's not actually buried in the churchyard. He's actually buried further along in those of you who've been there, far end of the Fishpool Valley. And there's a very nice little grave site, which apparently he loved being in the woods as well. So the title passed to his uncle, because his father's, I think, middle brother emigrated to Australia in about 1901 and stayed there. The current title, I think, is the 14th baronet, and it's still in Australia. So there we are. Now, this rather stern-looking gentleman was Henry Page Croft, who was created Baron Croft by Churchill, and he was what we used to call Lord Croft. And he was Under Secretary of State for War in Churchill's cabinet, and his job effectively was not making war, it was defending. So he decided, we're about to get invaded, we need to basically start creating a home defence force. And they created a thing called the Local Defence Volunteers, affectionately known as Look, Duck and Vanish. But they did evolve into the Home Guard. And he was also a member of the National Party that was probably to the right of reform. He and Churchill strongly disagreed about the empire, for example. Churchill was pragmatic, he wasn't. But you'll find his portrait in the dining room at Croft. It's a very nice one. So, basically, I mentioned right back at the beginning that the person who founded Croft Castle was Bernard de Croft. And Henry Page Croft had a son called Michael, who was Lord Croft up until about 1997. And his son was Bernard, and sadly died in about 2018. But that brings us full circle. Thank you.